Good evening, and welcome to this timely and significant program. I'm Camille Russell Love, Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Cultural Affairs for the City of Atlanta. The subject is the long arc of the global movement for justice, as seen through two moments of public truth-telling and through the experience of two great leaders. The first leader is Dr. King, as he came before the world at the 1963 March on Washington. The second leader is Nelson Mandela, along with his wife Winnie Mandela, as they were represented to the world through the work of art, Alvin Ailey's 1986 dance titled Survivors. The National Center for Civil and Human Rights is now a landmark and must-see destination in Atlanta. And I'm thrilled that the substantive conversations are continuing with the Ailey organization in advance of their annual performances at the Fox Theater. For more than 60 years, Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater has been on a mission to inspire, unite, and educate. This is the seventh time since 2015 that Ailey has come together with the center to present thought-provoking discussions as part of the organization's ongoing commitment to the people of Atlanta and followers of the center around the world. It is a great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. Artistic Director of Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, Robert Battle. In 2011, at the selection of Judith Jamison, Robert Battle became only the third person to head this company since it was founded in 1958. And the New York Times declared that he injected the company with new life. Honored as one of the masters of African American choreography by the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, in 2021, he received the dance world's highest honor, the prestigious Dance Magazine Award. Our next panelist is Dr. Clarissa Myrick-Harris, a professor of Africana Studies and co-founder of the Cultural Heritage Preservation and Digital Humanities Initiative at Morehouse College. She is a 2022 recipient of the President Joseph R. Biden Lifetime Achievement and Volunteer Service Award for her more than 30 years as a higher education leader, scholar activist, public historian, and an author. Dr. Myrick is the convener of the Committee to Commemorate the Atlanta Student Movement, an initiative that includes a symposium series, exhibits, articles, and a book project on student activism of the 1950s and the 1960s. Nasha Thomas, master teacher and former dancer, an Ailey Company member during the tenure of founder Alvin Ailey and artistic director emerita Judith Jamison, Nasha now uses dance to enrich the lives of children. Implementing Ailey arts and education programs across the country from Gracie Mansion to the White House and in public school classrooms from coast to coast. As National Director of AileyCamp, she leads the Inspiring Summer Program for middle school students in 10 U.S. cities, including Atlanta, where AileyCamp will be presented for the first time this year in partnership with Purpose Built Schools Atlanta. Lance Wheeler, Director of Exhibitions at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Lance believes museums are and should be places that take individuals on a spiritual journey, bridging the past with the present and beyond, which was also manifested in his previous role as the inaugural curator of exhibitions at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. As a public historian and community curator, his work with civil rights families and organizations like the Medgar and Merle Evans Institute connected communities and engaged youth. Lance currently serves on the Southeastern Museum Conference Council. And to moderate this evening, we welcome a special guest, NBC News correspondent Blayne Alexander. A four-time Emmy Award nominee, Blayne leads MSNBC and NBC News coverage of Georgia politics and places a special focus on stories involving race and equality. She lives in Atlanta with her husband Jay and their one-year-old daughter Sage. We are thrilled that she was able to arrange her schedule to moderate tonight's panel. Please welcome all of our panelists. And Blayne, can you start the discussion?
Absolutely. I am honored and thrilled to do so. Camille, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to our fantastic panelists. And thank you to all of you guys for joining us virtually. You know, I have to say, you heard little snippets of everyone's bios, but what you heard just now is only a fraction of the knowledge and the perspective and the intellect that you have ahead of you tonight. I've got to say that when we were preparing for this call, we actually had to slice down the bio. So if we read it in their entirety, we would still be listening to them right now. So just know that you're in for a treat tonight. I think there are a couple of housekeeping items I want to get to. Of course, this is going to be a collaborative discussion. I'm going to address different questions to different panelists, but I want us to all join in for a very robust conversation. But we also want the audience to get involved as well. And so we're going to reserve some time at the end of this for audience questions. If you do have some questions, make sure to send them in the comments section, type them in, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So please do not be shy there. Before we begin our conversation, I just want to kind of get us in the right mindset and set the stage of this conversation in the time frame we're talking about. August of 1963. So let's go back in time about 60 years. Of course, when we talk about August, when we think of 1963, we think of Dr. King. He was the culminating speaker at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That was a major moment. It was a major step back in it, or a step forward rather, and it dramatically advanced the American Civil Rights Movement. And I think that, of course, we can't be here and not talk about the fact that while we know so much about that moment in history, we can all very much learn something from the exhibit that is currently at the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Now is the time, remembering the legacy of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So Lance, of course, will talk more about that later. That's one point that we're talking about. But at the same time, also in August of 1963, 8,000 miles away in South Africa, we had a very different moment happening. Nelson Mandela was in prison, of course. The Rivonia trial had ended with the sentence of life imprisonment for his efforts to end apartheid in South Africa. So what we have is this moment in history where we have these two parallel kind of incidents when you talk about movement, one that's a great step forward and the other that was a terrible setback. So it's with that time frame in mind, with that period and in that mind space that I want us to enter this discussion. And Robert, I'm going to come to you first. I think it's only fitting. So let's talk about survivors. I think that we're going to show a clip of this in a moment so that we can all kind of get a sense of what this piece looks like. But it's incredibly moving. I'm struck by the fact that, of course, it debuted in 1986, so 37 years ago. Talk to us about survivors. Talk to us about the message that it sends, and why is it so important now? Why was it so important at this moment to remount this historic work?
Thank you so much, and what a pleasure to be with all of you. And of course, Ailey loves Atlanta, and we're very excited to bring this work and many other works to you, especially during Black History Month. I have to say that Survivors, which was, of course, created in 1986 by Alvin Ailey, I think the resonance of the work, even in the time that it was created, was, yes, about the story of Winnie and Nelson Mandela, but it was also the story and the reality of injustice everywhere. It's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I think that that is central to the reason, from hearing interviews from Mr. Ailey and reading about the work and knowing about his work, that he believed in the universality of the message, that he would often use something very specific to express something, I would say, global, and hold that mirror to society. And so it is To me, Alvin Ailey at his most raw in terms of the expression of the work. That is what struck me, that even in hearing him talk about his rage about the situation and expressing that, even when you hear the score, Max Roach, incredible genius percussionist, and Abby Lincoln, who is, the voice of pain, of freedom, of resistance. And even in that, when she sings, there are no words. There's a sense of being wounded. I mean, at times, she is just a guttural scream. And I think about in this time when you know, even today with Tyree Nichols and hearing his mother at the funeral and feeling that pain. Alvin Ailey was always ahead of his time. And so to only frame it within the context of the subject matter being Nelson and Winnie Mandela, I think is to miss the broader message that he was trying to convey that we need to hear now. And so the question is, why now bring it back? It hasn't been seen in 30 something years or what have you, is because that pain, those realities still exist. And Alvin Ailey is still trying to teach us something. So is Nelson Mandela. And so that to me is the reason that I wanted very much to bring this work back. Alvin Ailey wanted us to be, yes, about entertainment, but also about informing and educating, right? And being able to see works that matter.
I think that's a beautiful just summary of that, and I think it's a beautiful primer for showing a bit of this. What stuck out to me was when you talked about that this was just Ailey at his most raw, and that you could feel the rage. So with that, if we can, I think we have a bit of Survivors queued up. I want to show that to our audience now. I think that is so powerful, and that's only a snippet of it. Robert, I want to get you just to comment on that really quickly before I bring the rest of the panel in. That silence was so powerful, right? When before the bars came down. Talk a little bit about that, but I'm curious what sort of feedback you've gotten. You talked about what Mr. Ailey wanted to convey there. Over the years, how has that been received? What sort of feedback have people given?
Well, I mean, I can't really speak to over the years because, I mean, I hadn't, it hadn't been brought back, certainly not during my time. But the feedback that I have gotten was that this felt so timely and necessary to see this work, to never forget, right? I mean, I think that that's what's so important about this work. And Nasha Thomas can speak to this because she was an original cast member when it was created in 1986. And the fact that on one occasion specifically, when the work was going to be performed in Florida, there were threats of violence that were phoned in to the theater that if we performed it, right, considering this was about apartheid and the rest, that could be violence. So think about that in terms of the power of the work. Even and when you talk about that moment, that silence that is so powerful, because I think it conveys the weight of the situation, of the message, and I think it creates discomfort. And sometimes we need to sit in that discomfort, right? I mean, we're used to all kinds of noise, right, to keep us from having, right, to be in that discomfort that sometimes only silence can really afford us, so that we can move forward to sort of what's happening in that moment, right? And it's something different for everybody. And I think that's what's powerful about it. But to think about Alvin Ailey, to think about the arts, anytime you think about a dictatorship or whatever it may be in a country, what's the first thing that they try to take away? It is critical thinking. It is using the imagination. This is where the arts have such an impact. So you want to get rid of books, you want to get rid of art, you want to get rid of all of that, so that people are not tuned in to that silence in a way, right? Not tuned into that sense of being reflective. And so that's why I thought this work was important. The other thing I just want to say, and I don't want to be too long-winded, although I've already been long-winded, but one last thing I would say about that, during the pandemic, as we went through and are still going through a racial reckoning, and of course, the movement of Black Lives Matter, which is so important, I also wanted to make people understand that sometimes when we think about people like Alvin Ailey, right, who are no longer with us, he founded this company on the brink of the civil rights movement, that in some ways they were safe, right? No, he was a living embodiment of the notion that Black Lives Matter. He was making statements at a time that were not safe, right? That could have cost him everything, funding and the rest, when it wasn't in vogue, right? That everybody wanted to sort of say, oh, wow, good, you have a statement on your website, we want to support you. No, silence was sometimes seemingly safer, but he knew better than that. And he had the audacity to stick his neck out and make a work like Survivors in 1986. I think that we have to contextualize work, historic work, right? Sometimes we just don't do that. We just sort of see it for what it is. You have to contextualize the time in which the work was made. At that time, we did not know that Nelson Mandela would ever be released. This was a life sentence. So think about the weight of that moment. And I think that he conveys that so brilliantly in Survivors.
I think that's just fascinating to me. Nasha, if I can, I want to bring you in as somebody who was a dancer in the company when that work was brought to life. Talk to me about, as I was kind of researching and reading about this, I heard one dancer in the company say that there is such a tremendous responsibility because you're helping to convey what Mr. Ailey was trying to feel in the pieces. If you could talk to me about the work Survivors, being in the company, did you dance in that piece? And if you could even just kind of speak to the environment and what you received as it was debuted in 1986.
Sure. Well, I had just gotten in the company, so it was my first year. So I was honored that Mr. Ailey chose me to be in the ballet first and foremost. But it was a very heavy ballet. It was not a dancey dance. It was very emotional about a subject matter and a person that was very serious. And it affected Mr. Ailey, and he wanted to tell his story, and he wanted us to be that vessel to tell the story. You had Dudley Williams, who was just a star in the company, and Sherelle Mesh, portraying Nelson and Winnie Mandela. And for us young artists, it was a challenge bringing out that emotion, those feelings, because we were not doing, a dancey dance. But then we had the opportunity to film the ballet in an actual prison. So, that put a whole nother level on what we were doing. And as Robert said, the voice of Abby Lincoln, I don't think I appreciated it and understood um, what it was, what I was a part of at that time, being so young in my 20s. But I listen to it now that the ballet has been brought back. And I tell you, if I had to do it today, I probably would approach it differently. But her voice, those guttural screams and just panting, and it made you feel something. And the fact that Nelson Mandela stood his ground, and I was just talking to someone about this recently, when something is wrong, it's wrong. And we could have to live in that wrongness, but it was so wrong that it had to change. You know, the society, the world had to change it. And he was freed. And that was an exhale. And I can just hear right now Abby Lincoln breathing. And at the end, and then, you know, Nelson Mandela was released. It was hard for us, you know, and as dancers, I was in the company and we did receive threats and we had to go on stage. We had a meeting with Mr. Ailey and he said to us, this is something that we have to do. This is what we do. We're artists and you are going to be fine. But can you imagine? The curtain is down and that's a comfort. That's a blanket on us. And once that curtain goes up, there's that vulnerability. And we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know, you know, what was going to happen. But what we did do was we trusted. We had trust in us as artists and our leader, Mr. Ailey, and we knew that everything was going to be okay. And it would have said something. I think just as Nelson Mandela stood his ground and he stood in his faith and his belief, we stood in our faith and our belief as artists and we kept performing.
Nasha, that's beautiful. And if that's not motivation to go and see the way that you described survivors and what that felt like, if that's not motivation to go and see it, I don't know what is. So Clarissa, I want to bring you into the conversation. And I want to call upon your perspective and your work to kind of help us connect the dots between what was happening in South Africa and the civil rights movement here in the US. I know in your work at Morehouse, of course, you study and you honor the civil rights movement, but you also take and maintain a global perspective. So help us make the connection between what we saw with the American civil rights movement and the global movement for racial justice.
Sure. First, Blayne, let me just say, in the wake of the more than a month of celebrations of the life of Martin Luther King Jr., and as we process and protest disturbing assaults on civil and human rights around the world and right here in our country, in Memphis, and in the banning and censoring of the teaching of African American history, in the wake of all that, it's an honor to be here participating in this conversation as a prelude to the performances later in the month by Alvin Ailey Dance Theater Company, and here in Atlanta as the exhibition, the March on Washington 60 Years Later, is opening up. It's an honor to be here. And I want to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Dr. Vicki Crawford, director of the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collection, who worked with Lance to develop the exhibition. Now, in answer to your question, I'm going to attempt to contextualize this history. First, as we know, during the post-World War II era, as the Cold War increased hostilities and froze relations between Western powers and communist bloc countries, there was a resurgence of extreme racism and discrimination facing African American veterans, their families, and communities here in America. Just as the civil rights movement surged with Dr. King and many, many others pushing against oppression and suppression of Black people in this country, the fight for freedom was ignited or revitalized among African people and other oppressed populations around the globe. We know that in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, and it was quoted earlier, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And Dr. King wrote that while he was in that little jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. But it's important to know that even during this time and before, in the 1950s, Dr. King was always a Pan-Africanist. And he was an internationalist, a vocal advocate for human rights around the world. He never had the chance to meet Nelson Mandela. In fact, he never even met Gandhi, the man who really greatly informed his perspective and philosophy and activism. But King understood the connections between colonialism, apartheid on the continent of Africa, and segregation and discrimination experienced by Black people in America. In March 1957, for instance, King and Mrs. Coretta Scott King traveled to West Africa to attend Ghana's, what was originally the Gold Coast, but then became Ghana's independence ceremony. That was soon after the successful Montgomery bus boycott. He was invited by Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah. In 1960, in Lagos, Nigeria, King attended the inauguration for the Governor General and Commander-in-Chief, Nnamdi Azikiwe. And by the way, it's important to note that both Nkrumah and Azikiwe of Nigeria, they both attended historically Black colleges. I have to give a shout out to our historically Black colleges, Lincoln for Nkrumah and Howard for the Governor General of Nigeria. The year before he attended the 1960 Nigerian inauguration, Dr. Ms. King visited India. Gandhi had died more than a decade before the Kings visited India. While visiting that country, he delivered a speech called The Achievement of Racial Justice in the World Today to the Indian Council of World Affairs. He also visited a school in southern India for the Dalit children, what was called the Untouchables, and came to understand the connections between, even more so, the connections between exclusion and exile, oppression that African Americans in the US face, and the Dalits of India. Although King never met Mandela, he communicated with other anti-apartheid leaders. As early as December 1957, he was among those who celebrated International Human Rights Day by rallying support for 156 anti-apartheid activists, including Mandela. Then years later, in December 1964, on his way to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, King, he stopped at Great Britain and he called for the US and Great Britain to institute an economic boycott of South Africa. I'm going to quote quickly because I know we want to keep moving here and others need to speak, but King said, quote, "There is much in Mississippi and Alabama to remind one of apartheid in South Africa, but even in Mississippi and Alabama, we can organize in nonviolent action. But in apartheid South Africa, even the mildest form of nonviolent resistance meets with years of imprisonment. And leaders over many, many years have been restricted and silenced and imprisoned. We can understand how in that situation, people felt so desperate that they turned to other methods. And so today, great leaders like Nelson Mandela are among the many hundreds wasting away in Robben Island prison." Okay, that's unquote. Mandela also greatly admired King. He quoted King repeatedly, and he loved that quote, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." And he said that after his release. He said that when he was inaugurated on the stage, and on that stage, Mrs. King was also seated to witness the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. So all that to say that those two men, even though they never met, were sympathetic and empathetic with each other's causes, and they were influenced by each other. And I'll just end because there's a lot more that can be said, of course, but I'll just end just noting that he noted in his book, in his 1965 speech, another speech that he gave in England, the struggle for freedom forms one long front crossing oceans and mountains. The brotherhood of man is not confined within a narrow, limited circle of select people. It is felt everywhere in the world. It is an international sentiment of surpassing, and I lost my strength, because this is true. When men of goodwill finally unite, they will be invincible. And I'll pause there.
I appreciate that so much. But I think that it's stunning sometimes to just realize the symbiotic relationship, or just the fact that they went so hand in hand when you talk about the civil rights
Yes.
movement, the fight to end apartheid. And I think that it's something, honestly, for so many people, for the general population, you only kind of scratch the surface when you think about
Right.
the civil rights movement, when you think about March on Washington. And Lance, I want to bring you into the conversation on that, because I think when we think about what's taught in schools, or just kind of what typically people consume in terms of knowledge, yes, there's the I Have a Dream speech. Yes, there are just kind of the cursory things about the March on Washington, but there's so much that people don't know unless they kind of seek it out. So that's why I'm so excited. That's why we should all be very excited about this exhibit. I'm going to say it again. Now is the time, remembering the legacy of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Talk to us about this exhibit. Tell us about this exhibit, and specifically the aspects that go beyond I Have a Dream. What does this look like? What will people experience, and what will surprise people as they kind of visit this exhibit?
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be on this panel with everyone, and I'm going to try to move quickly through this as well. But before we get to the exhibit, Dr. Vicki Crawford and I were thinking about the year 1963, and I think we have to put that in perspective first, because before the March on Washington, you had the Children's Crusade that happened May 2nd and May 3rd in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. You have May 28th, 1963, the Woolworth sit-in at Jackson, Mississippi, which is deemed one of the most violent. You have the University of Alabama being desegregated in 1963 on June 11th, right? And then you have the assassination of Medgar Wiley Evers, NWC Field Secretary, June 12th, 1963, right? And then you have James Meredith graduating from the University of Mississippi, what people call Ole Miss. And so we took that and we was like, okay, those are the things that were happening before the March on Washington. And so that informed our work. But really the center, and Dr. Vicki Crawford and I really wanted to pay homage to the people, because when we think about the day, we think of the leaders, right? But what makes the civil rights movement so special is that people made change, not just individuals. And so usually the exhibition itself has at least 30 to 40 artifacts. This one has about 21 in images and photographs of people. And so we wanted to show young people, seasoned folks, I like to say. We wanted to show women, we wanted to show men, we wanted to show people from different walks of life that made this special. And so some of the nuggets that you will see, you're going to see correspondence from sorry, I lost track. Josephine Baker, excuse me, James Farmer, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, Rabbi Prince. And so you're going to take a deeper dive. And then the real gem of the exhibition, in my opinion, is we have a early draft of what we know as I Have a Dream, but that speech is actually called Normacy Never Again. And so it's important that King was using the dream metaphor even before 1963. He used it in 1962 in North Carolina, Rocky Mountain, North Carolina. And then we see it earlier actually take place in Detroit in 1963. And so those are some of the things that we want visitors to take away and walk away with when they see this exhibition. And then also the impact from the March on Washington. You do not have the Black Lives Matter movement without the March on Washington, right? We don't have the Voter Rights Act. We don't have the Fair Housing Act of 68. We don't have the American Disabilities Act of 1990. And so we wanted really visitors to walk away, with that knowledge of this special day.
And I was going to ask you that, Lance. I mean, in context of looking at history, but there's something about what happened 60 years ago that really kind of informs today when you look at everything that's happening in the world today. Is there that connection that people should make when they walk away from this exhibit, almost thinking in a different way about the current times that we're walking in?
Yeah, for us, the connection is that, once again, you don't have this special day without, you don't have 1963 March on Washington without the civil unrest in 2020, right? You don't have all these individuals saying we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? Fannie Lou Hamer, but you have young people and senior folks saying, let's make a difference. Our voices matter in society. And so that is the real big connectivity that we want people to walk away with from the exhibition.
Sure. I appreciate that. Nasha, I want to bring you in, and I want to talk to you in your capacity as the director of AileyCamp, leader of AileyCamp, because I think that as we talk about the past, none of it, works unless we kind of bring it forward to the future. We talk about present day and the future, and the next generation is that future. So before I get to your question, I want to show a little snippet just so our audience is familiar with AileyCamp, and then I'll ask you a question on the other side.
Sure.
The arts require everything that everything in life needs. You need discipline, you need focus, you need concentration, you need to work hard.
My favorite class is West African because you do not stop, and it's really thrilling for me because you just never stop moving. You always keep going until the dance is over.
I think what I enjoy the most is creative communication, which is basically it's all art class.
I always try to incorporate various ways to communicate their inner narrative. So taking on self-portraits is not only reimagining, but honoring yourself.
It costs you nothing to use your imagination, but if you don't use it, it could cost you everything.
And we have affirmations that we say every day. They have 10 affirmations, and we use the 4 agreements by Miguel Ruiz.
I am in control. I will think before I act. I will think before I act.
My favorite affirmation is I will listen to learn, because when I'm outside of camp, I still have the uniform on. I still represent Alvin Ailey.
Oh, you get one chance, I tell them. And what do you want people to see?
I get the biggest smile when I watch that clip. I've watched it like 10 times already, just kind of preparing for this. And hearing those kids say those affirmations, it gives me chills. I love it so much. So this is just a fantastic, fantastic program. I want to ask you, one of the things that we've talked about here during this discussion is the notion of themes and kind of the universal message that's being conveyed through Mr. Ailey's work. Talk to me about introducing that message and those themes to the next generation, especially when we talk about kind of the types of things that we've been discussing here, the types of things we've been discussing here. How does it hit them? How does it impact them? And what's it like to introduce that to them?
Well, Mr. Ailey he understood the importance of our youth and their need to be nurtured, and also to have a platform, what I say, a platform to express themselves, to have a voice. AileyCamp does that. And Mr. Ailey was a visionary, and to lead our young people and give them an opportunity to have a voice, they definitely need a theme. So, I do come up with these themes every year. And affirmations are things that we say that we believe that we want to embody. The program is for youth ages 11 to 14. Dance is the vehicle that we use. But another thing, Alvin was a genius. The program is about life skills, critical thinking. We look at what our youth are struggling with today: peer pressure, how to resolve conflict without fighting and yelling and arguing, how to take care of their bodies, health and nutrition, decision making. I always tell our young people, it's not about whether a choice that you make is right or wrong. It's what's best for you at this particular time. Mr. Ailey took the time from himself. One of the last things that he did before he passed away to start this AileyCamp, which has been replicated in more than 10 cities around the country. And, for me, it's like breathing. These young people are so intuitive, so smart. They have so many gifts and so many things to share. And they need a place where they can come to feel safe, where they can grow and develop and feel that they matter, which is what I said. And, just saying, I will greet this day with love in my heart. How many times do we wake up and we go, oh my gosh, here I have to do this. I am a winner. If you can tell yourself those things and not have to wait and depend on someone else, it gives you a strength, a sense of being. We're all into self-care and self-love now. It's important that we are instilling these things in our young people at such a young age, ages 11 to 14, which is a very difficult transitional time. They are trying to figure out who they are, what they want, what they believe, who should they follow. And we have a phenomenal group of role models, who are leading them and guiding them and pushing them to think, and to articulate what they feel about a situation or something, how it affects them. How many times does someone ask you, what do you like about yourself? And it doesn't happen often. And it's a beautiful place that they all come to where they can celebrate themselves, learn about Alvin Ailey and dance in the arts, and perhaps we are developing some future arts enthusiasts so that when they come to a city like Atlanta, they will go to the museums and they will watch a PBS special on television. And they will, as when they grow up and they become parents, it will be a part of their family tradition that they go and celebrate and support the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. If they don't learn these things at a young age, how are they going to know about them? And to know that education is important and that they should start to think now about what they want to do with their lives and who they want to become. All of these things Mr. Ailey thought about when he put this program together. So I have, I say I have the best job. I think I have the best job in the world. I wake up every day and the program was so well structured. I don't have to think about how I can make it better. What else can I do? My job, which I love, is how can I enhance the experience? How can I enhance the experience for the camper? And how can I enhance the experience for my staff who are leading them and nurturing them and guiding them?
Nasha, I say this with all sincerity. It sounds like something that, yes, fantastic for kids, but adults could benefit from too. When you talk about just like the affirmations and the looking inside and what do you love about yourself, it's truly powerful. I want to, as promised, to get to some audience questions. We've got about 18 minutes or so left in our discussion, so I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to. So if you're listening, if you're watching, please put some questions in the chat. We've got one about revelations, and I'm so glad that somebody brought this up because I was going to bring it up if nobody else did. But this question, Robert, is for you. One, Revelations was created in 1960. It's kind of a two-part question to put the two together. One, what do you think it is about this piece that's so timeless and that always touches the audience, no matter where you go, no matter where it is, why it's so synonymous almost with Ailey? What is it about that is so timeless? And secondly, how did Revelations and the arts change you? A question from Judith.
Wow. Well, thank you for that question. I think about it and thinking about Revelations that Alvin Ailey created in 1960, this suite of spirituals that expresses the sorrows, the hopes, the joy, the resilience of African Americans in this country, and the central role of faith, right? Yeah. And it reminds us that we're standing on shoulders, right? That there is something about, I think that is always a reminder of that. And also something I think about is, there's this wonderful documentary called Ailey that came out a year or two ago. And it was something Cicely Tyson said when she was presenting him with the Kennedy Center honor. And at one point in the speech, she said, Alvin Ailey is Black and universal. And that to me is embedded in Revelations that no matter, and I always say this, whether we're across the street or across the ocean, anybody can connect with the common humanity that is embedded in that. When I think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I think about the way you put it, Doctor, when you were talking about this idea of resistance in terms of being able to tap into people's humanity, right, by nonviolent resistance. I just think about how Revelations galvanizes people. I mean, I have had the wonderful opportunity now as artistic director to see Revelations in many different countries, many different places. When I first took over as artistic director, the transition just happened to happen while we were on tour in Russia. Don't send any letters. This was about 11 years ago, not yesterday. Anyway, but I remember being in these old theaters, right? I never felt so far away from home in my life, right? I'm Liberty City. Do you know what I'm saying? What's this boy doing up here in Russia? And I remember the response from the audience as if we were, you know, in my hometown church where my mother played the piano for when I was a kid, Wachter Temple AME Zion Church. There was such a sense of breaking down that fourth wall that by the end of Revelations, and this happens everywhere, certainly in Atlanta, that we are all together, right? We are all dancing as one in whatever way that is. It's a masterpiece, full stop, you know? And I think that's why it still has resonance today. To think about 1960 when Alvin Ailey created this work and had the audacity to end this work with a message of hope. It reminds me of something in Dr. Maya Angelou's poem that she did for the inauguration of then President Clinton. And she says, "The horizon leans forward, offering you space to place new steps of change." I think Revelations has that kind of catharsis that makes us feel hopeful about today, about tomorrow. And it continues to have that resonance. It's amazing.
It really is amazing. You know, I from a personal standpoint, when I think about Revelations, I remember going to see Ailey when I was a little girl growing up in Oklahoma. So we're talking about the 90s or so. But I remember as a young girl seeing that and just how powerful it is. And I've seen it different stages of my life, and it always hits me differently each time.
Yeah.
Which I think just kind of speaks to just how timeless it is. And I feel different things. I think different things. The emotions hit differently. And now as I prepare to go see it in February, and we'll give a plug for that later, but here in Atlanta, when I think back about when it was created, it gives a whole new layer of just significance to it, that it was created in 1960 and just what that means in the perspective of it as well. I think, you know, we've got about 12 minutes left. I want to touch on something, Robert, that you said earlier, and Lance and Clarissa, I'm going to bring you into this conversation. And I think this will be the note that I ask all of you to comment on to wrap this up. This notion of sitting in the discomfort. And Robert, you brought that up when you talk about survivors and really kind of forcing people to come face to face with what can be an uncomfortable history or uncomfortable truths. I think we're all familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, led by Bishop Desmond Tutu. At the center here in Atlanta, we have the Truth and Transformation Initiative, which helps people kind of come face to face with the painful parts of Atlanta's history. So when you think about that, you think about sitting in discomfort, and this is for all of you. Lance, I'm going to begin with you from the perspective at the center in this initiative. Why is it so important to bring that into a public realm? Why is it so important to have those face-to-face moments and have that almost kind of discomfort, not just showing and saying, here's history, but really making people come face-to-face with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a question that we often get asked. And so it makes me think of a Coretta Scott King quote that I reflect on and I love. And it goes, struggling is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and you win it in every generation. And so for me, that bridges the gap between the past and the present. And so I think it's important to understand that the gravity of the past, if we don't understand that, we can't move forward in our future. And so when I think about history, I see it as a rhythm with ebbs and flows. And so for us to understand that, we can't talk about suffering if it's only a thing of the past, because we are still currently today still fighting for those things, right? And so we're thinking about voting rights. We're still fighting for that. Fighting economically. We're still fighting police brutality, fair housing, equal education, right? LGBT plus rights. We're still struggling. So that suffering is still happening right now. And so when we talk about how do we have these deeper conversations, we also have to think about our present, right? For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And the present day struggle that led to that change. And if we think about the past, what about those things that led up to the March on Washington? And so it is important for us to understand that history doesn't stop just because we want it to stop, right? And that we have to find ways to take a deeper dive and have these hard conversations to move society forward. But I also want to say, before just the pain and suffering, the difficulties, it's also important while we're having these conversations that we also highlight the good and the positives and the victories and the wins as well, right? Because we're often always stuck in saying, well, the struggle was so hard, but even through that struggle, there are moments of laughter, victory, wins. And so that's why it's important for us to have these conversations. And this is why this panel discussion is important as well.
No, I thank you for that. And I think, Lance, you almost perhaps answered the question that I'm going to ask of Clarissa, but I want the perspective, because when I think about protests that currently happen, a lot of times when I cover them, as a correspondent, I spend time talking to kind of dozens of people in the streets, and there's oftentimes a sense of frustration. People say, oh, my parents were out here protesting, or I protested for Trayvon Martin when I was 12 and now I'm 23 and I'm doing the same thing. There's this frustration with almost the repetition, or the fact that we can look in history books and look at exhibits and see struggles that many people feel are still being fought today. So I guess my question for you, Clarissa, from a history standpoint, what encouragement does history offer for those who say that they're still in the struggle today, fighting for things that should have been overcome? What encouragement is there that we can take from history here?
Yes. Well, the encouragement comes from looking at and understanding the lessons, the individuals, not only the collective efforts of these earlier versions of our ongoing struggle for social change, civil rights, human rights, but looking at those individuals who participated in, led these movements, these demonstrations, these marches, and their courage, and how they negotiated the movements. In the 60s, in the days before social media, and the internet in general, they used mimeograph machines, they used telephones, they canvassed and so on. That tenacity, that devotion, that dedication is something that that our activists today, young activists today in particular, can look to and learn from. They struggled, the activists of the 50s, the 60s, and I work with a group who include or compose primarily of the veterans of the Atlanta student movement. There's still many of them very much with us and still active, still fighting for change, and still teaching directly and indirectly the young folk who want to know, well, how do we do this? Who might get frustrated. They got frustrated as well, but they also learned how to channel that frustration into actions that did make changes, some might say incremental changes, but made changes that could be built upon. And that's what we need to look to? What were those achievements, those accomplishments, those victories that were made, whether we're looking at the Atlanta student movement and the outcomes of their activism, which led to the desegregation of public facilities and restaurants and libraries in the city of Atlanta, and ultimately influenced the outcome of the 1960 presidential election. That's another story. That group in Atlanta, here in Atlanta, actually influenced the outcome. When they got Dr. King involved in the movement, in the protest, he was jailed in Reedsville Penitentiary. Kennedy made a call. King was released. And that set off actions that rallied Black Americans behind Kennedy when Nixon was the candidate of choice in 1960, the Republican candidate. But they were able to reverse things, much like what happened a few years ago. But in any case, Black people rallied around John F. Kennedy. And so that also helped to usher in a new phase in the movement for civil rights. And as a result, we did get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act under initially Kennedy and then continued by Johnson, of course. So look to the history, look to the individuals who made that history to get lessons and just a sense of purpose and dedication, renewal, revitalization as you move forward in the movement today.
Absolutely. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Nasha, I think I'll give the final word to you. When we talk about AileyCamp and we talk about the next generation and just the powerful things that you're doing with the kids, is it ever a struggle to get them to understand this or to get them to feel these types of themes that we're talking about? Oftentimes we can talk about history and it feels ancient. Is it ever a struggle to get them to feel this? They're born, thankfully, in a different type of generation.
No, it's not a struggle. And when AileyCamp started, we used to say it was for at-risk youth. And right now, every child in the country is at risk. It doesn't matter if you're from an affluent family or for a family that doesn't have a lot of resources. And they understand. They have their own struggles. They go through struggles every day. So they are not separating, this struggle from that struggle or this incident from that incident. It all affects them. And the sad thing is that a lot of times they are not the ones that we think about when all of this stuff is going on, but they're the ones that are going to grow up. And I think the world that they're going to live in is the one that they're making now. So it's very, very easy. They have so much to say. One of the things we do in the program is, they're allowed to write and to do spoken word and bring their thoughts and feelings to the stage and share it with each other. I want to applaud the mayor, Andre Dickens, for making this the year of the youth. They are very important. Their voices are important. They're the ones that are going to make the change. They're the ones that are going to make the changes. Our voices are stronger and our presence is stronger right now, but they're going to grow up and they're watching all of this and they're listening and they're forming their own thoughts and ideas and opinions and ways that they want to deal with things. They're very, very smart, very, very smart young people. And I think one of the last things I would say that is important, and this is what I give, and this is what AileyCamp is about. It's about love, and I think we say it, and it seems like a little, fluff thing, but it is one of the most important things. If we can love each other and and love ourselves, it makes the work so much easier. It's not about this. I had a speaker come in and speak to a group of alumni this past weekend, and he said something that stuck with me. It's not about you, so it's not about me. And that's something, me. No, it's not about you. It's about us. It's about the other person. And our young people are the future. So no, it's not hard at all.
Yeah. Nasha, I think that's a perfect way to end it. And it shows that we're in good hands. We are absolutely in good hands with our future.
I agree with you there.
I think we could keep going, but we have to wrap it up here. I just want to thank all of you. Robert Battle, Dr. Clarissa Myrick-Harris, Nasha Thomas, and Lance Wheeler. If we were actually in a space together, I know that the applause would be thunderous. So thank you for this robust conversation. I learned a lot. I was taking my own notes personally, and I hope that everybody here watching did as well. So thank you all. And before we wrap, I've got just two very important little housekeeping notes. One, to let you know that the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater is coming to Atlanta, February 16th through 19th at the Fox Theater. It's part of a 22-city North American tour, and we've got the website there scrolling at the bottom if you want to purchase tickets, if you want to get more information. If you've not seen it before, if you've seen it 1,000 times, come out. It is always going to be fantastic and worth it. So make sure that you do that. And then also, if you happen to be visiting Atlanta, make sure that you visit the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. You see the exhibition that we're talking about and the many other exhibits that are there as well.
And Blayne, I just want to add, AileyCamp Atlanta is back 2023 at Price Middle School.
Absolutely. How can people get more information about that, Nasha?
Applications, they can go to Price Middle School's website or Purpose Built Schools of Atlanta. It's June 5th through July 15th, 6 weeks, and it's free. Doesn't cost anything.
We love to hear that. And what age range? Remind us real quick.
11 to 14, middle school, grades 6 through 8.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nasha. And thank you all for joining us tonight. This has been powerful. This has been wonderful. And before you sign off, we're going to scroll through just some images of the exhibit as well. If you'd like to stay on for a few more minutes, watch that through. But thank you all for a fantastic discussion and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.